Jesus' humble service was an example for us. So this is an unpopular topic and an unpopular example and an unpopular teaching. So you might guess that not everybody likes to apply it, although the people who do apply it, we often revere. So Mother Teresa, when she was starting out, wanted permission to do what she had in mind and became famous for, and she was told, no, you can't do that. She could have rebelled. She could have said, yes, I'm going to do that, I'm starting my own thing. But she submitted humbly. And because she did, over time, people learned that they could trust her. That her heart was one that was willing to follow instruction even if she disagreed with it. That she was willing to be part of the team and not try and tear it apart. And because of the trust that got built up because of that relationship, she eventually got to do what she wanted in probably far greater scope than she ever could have imagined. Humility is something that many people don't like. They would rather be forceful and in many cases arrogant and get their way. But what happens often is that when someone is arrogant and forceful, what they get is opposition or less cooperation than they might get. We're going to look at the idea of humility in a number of contexts. The first context we're going to look at is in Moses getting talked to by a couple other leaders. Numbers 12:33 and following says, Moses was very humble, more so than anyone else on the face of the earth. And the reason that we hear this commentary is because Moses was being talked to by some of the other co-leaders who said, you know, we hear God's voice too, and you should not have married that woman. And so they were talking to Moses about something that had already happened, and they were telling him that it wasn't right. So we get this story. First hearing that Moses was humble, and then hearing that God calls all of them out to the tent of meeting. So God, watching this, says, come out, you three, to the tent of meeting. And then the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent. So I'm not sure what this looked like exactly, but in those days they had often seen God appear as a pillar of cloud or in a variety of other guises, and they were familiar with this, so they know that they're standing in the presence of God. And while they're in the presence of God, God starts to speak to them. God says, when there are prophets among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to them in visions. So God, did you catch that first part? There are not always prophets. Paul says we should, each of us, earnestly strive after the gift of prophecy. It's so valuable. But there are times when there aren't any prophets. Nobody's striving for the gift. Nobody's put in the time to practice. And so the Word of God is not being proclaimed in advance because nobody is desiring that gift and nobody knows how to do it. Sometimes there's no prophets. In an area, sometimes in a century, there are very few prophets. When there are prophets, God says, so it's not always the case that there are, but when there are prophets, I, God, make myself known to them in visions. I don't know if you've ever had a vision, but visions are the kinds of things where you say, well, I saw that, I just don't know what it meant. Peter, in one of his visions, saw a cloth come down from heaven. On it were all kinds of things that you now eat, but in those days were forbidden. So it looked pretty much like your buffet line, but in those days you couldn't eat pigs or lobsters or a variety of things. Peter looked at this collection of food that was forbidden, and the voice said to him, have lunch, eat. Peter said, I know the law. I know what God told us. I'm not eating any of those things. They're disgusting. Went back up into heaven, came back down, same thing to help him get the point. 3 times. A knock on his door. Was it a lobster appearing at his door? No. Was it a pig that showed up at his door? No. Was it anything related directly to any of the animals that he'd seen inside that? Or a cook offering him a nice lobster biscuit? No. He saw a vision of a bunch of creatures and the vision was not about the content directly. And this trips people up often when they have visions. It was not about the content directly, it was about the concept. Peter, you've been faithful, you've been doing good, you've been rejecting things that I told you to, but now I need you to not reject some things. Now, Peter, when I show you something that you think in your spirit, that's not good, that's awful, you need to not reject it. So the ultimate point was not what many of us would think, oh good, I can eat anything. No, that wasn't the point. The point was, Peter, when you have a judgment against someone, and I'm sending someone right now to knock on your door, when you have a judgment against someone that you think they're not acceptable, I got to declare them acceptable. Visions are very difficult to decode. Peter could have decoded that vision in a lot of different ways and it would have sounded plausible. It would have seemed likely. It happened that he got a knock at the door from someone outside his people group, someone that Peter thought he should never associate with, someone that Peter thought the gospel should not go to. And the person said, we want to hear the story of Jesus. We need you to come with us. Peter saw this vision, and it took quite a while to figure out. Now, here's a question for you, and I don't know the answer to it. Why didn't God just say it directly? Peter, some guys are coming to your door, go with them. Wouldn't that be easier than coming up with a sheet and having all the drama? Apparently, God likes the drama department, I'm not sure. Often, when God speaks to us, it's in a visual, metaphorical code that needs to be deciphered. So, Moses is being accused by a couple of his co-leaders. They're all taken out to the tent meeting. God appears to them. God says, look, when they're prophets, I make myself known to them in visions and things that have to be interpreted, things that aren't easy to explain at the start. I speak to them in dreams, things that are fuzzy, things that where one thing is standing in for another, things where you can't trust your emotions. Many times people are afraid in their dreams, but the fear is not God's point. The fear is you have been afraid, you need to have courage, or something else. The dreams are not... If you have a dream about eating pizza, it doesn't mean you should go out and eat pizza. But it may mean something specific, enlightening, if you have the tools to understand what the code means. I speak to people in dreams, God says, prophets and others, but not so with Moses. With Moses, he's entrusted with my whole house. And with him I speak clearly, face to face, clearly not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord. So Moses, unlike Peter and prophets today and prophets in Moses' day, God was speaking directly, without symbols. Here's what I want. Here's who I am. Here's what the situation is like. Moses wasn't hearing riddles. Moses was speaking to God face to face. So, just so you know on that, it's easy for us to think that a person is not doing God's will when we don't know the background story. But sometimes God is moving through their life with power in the way that is causing an offense to you. And when you get offended, you really need to take it up with God, and in some cases apologize for getting offended, rather than trying to correct the person that you think is so wrong. Satan's job: lie, kill, steal, destroy, and accuse. If you're in the camp of causing division and accusing people, besmirching their reputation, casting them down, even if you clothe it in a religious garb, that's what Satan's job is. God's job is very different. The fruit of God's Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. So the things that God does build people up. So Satan, coming to Moses, will say, "You're a murderer. You do not deserve to be a leader." And God will say, "You, in a fit of anger, murdered someone. And I love you. And we are going to work that out to bring glory to me." The voices are extraordinarily different, although the content may be about the same kind of thing. Psalm 25, verse 9. God leads the humble in what is right and teaches the humble his way. If you want to know what's right, one way you can do it is by becoming more humble. Humble people get led by God. One of the reasons that God was speaking directly to Moses, no riddles, no vision, not in visions that needed to be decoded, but directly, face to face, straightforward, was that Moses was the most humble person in all the earth. That's pretty humble. And he was leading the entire nation. It's very uncommon to get someone who's leading at that capacity who is also the most humble person in all the earth. But because Moses was in that capacity, hugely gifted, great responsibility, and great humility, God was speaking to him directly about what was right. Psalm says, that'll happen to anyone who's humble. God leads the humble in what is right, and God teaches the humble God's way. But the proud, James says, God opposes. God opposes the proud. God works against them, stands against them. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. In the Bible, one of the things that is helpful when you hear a teaching is to look at the lives of people and see how they behaved. And then see, what did the Bible say about their behavior? Was it good or bad? So the Bible records many people's behavior. The Bible records people's sin. And if you read about somebody who sinned, it doesn't mean you should follow their example. There are many examples in the Bible that are there because they're bad examples. They're examples of things you should not try because they are dangerous or they lead to destruction, they cause harm to people. James says, submit yourselves to God. Resist the devil, and the devil will flee from you. Many people, I've used this illustration before, but I think it's helpful. I at least need to hear it far more often because it takes me a while to remember it. Resisting is not standing next to the temptation and saying no. Your willpower is limited. If you should not eat chocolate cake and are standing in the presence of a chocolate cake, you are using up your willpower so that it's a finite amount. It gets recharged, but it's a finite amount that you have today. So if you use up all your willpower by intentionally standing next to something that's not good to you and resisting, when you go down the street and encounter something that you should really resist, you will not have enough willpower for it. So you should not stand in the presence of whatever it is that's bad for you. You should get away from that. Resisting the devil is not standing in the presence of your area of sin and just saying, no, I won't do that, until your willpower is gone, and so you walk a few feet away and yell at your kids or do whatever it is. For those of you who have already yelled at your kids today, I'm sorry about that example. Sometimes kids should be yelled at, but probably less often than we do it. Resist the devil and the devil will flee from you. What is it like to resist the devil? Resisting the devil is actively doing something. So if you're being tempted by something, you don't stand in the presence, you get out of that presence and you do something active to resist. So you could pray for Afghanistan. Average age people die over there is 39 years old. God, help people to come to know you as Lord. Help people to acknowledge Jesus as the risen Savior. In Afghanistan, let everybody know the love of God. And let people begin to live long, prosperous lives. So that the enemy has been stealing people's lives. From 39, that's not long enough. So help people in Afghanistan to begin to walk in their anointing, to begin to walk in their destiny, to be able to walk in what you created them to be. Now, for you, it may be something else. You might have a regard for a different nation, a different people group, but do something active that is resisting the devil. That's quite effective, and it's far more effective than standing in the presence of the thing you're trying to avoid and just saying, no, I won't. Draw near to God, James says, and God will draw near to you. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and God will exalt you. As we humble ourselves before God, it brings blessing. So, I mentioned it just a couple minutes ago that it's helpful to look at the example of people and see how did they do it. In all this conversation about being humble, what does it look like? And one example that Jesus had was from John 13. Curiously, when John remembers the Last Supper, this is what he remembers. John doesn't tell us about Jesus taking bread and breaking it. He doesn't tell us about Jesus offering wine and saying it's his blood. What John remembers as of being of primary importance at that last meal is Jesus poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, something that only a servant would do. And since they didn't have a servant there, nobody was willing to do. Jesus did. So he gets to Peter. Peter says, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Which is kind of obvious if maybe Peter is first. He sees the bucket of water. He sees Jesus getting ready. Lord, you can't be really serious. Jesus says, you don't know now what I'm doing, but later you will understand. And Peter says, you will never wash my feet. You're the leader. You shouldn't be doing something like that. That's something that we pay people to do, but the CEO never does stuff like this. You will never wash my feet. Jesus says, if I don't wash you, you have no share with me. Well, Peter wants to be a follower of Jesus, wants to have a share in what Jesus is doing. So Peter, okay, if that's the way it works, don't stop at my feet. I want to be all in. So not just my feet. Wash my hands and my head. I want to be fully engaged with you, Jesus. I want to have a full share. Jesus says, if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash one another's. I maybe skipped something there, did I? Let me look at the text. It's not there, no wonder. Okay, so we're at John, the 13th chapter. Let's see if there's something in this story that's not on that slide. We're going to start at verse 15. No. Let's look at 10. Jesus said to Peter, "One who has bathed does not need to wash except for the feet. That person who's bathed is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you." So once again, Jesus speaks to his disciples like God speaks to prophets, in visions and dreams and things that are hard to understand. When Jesus says not all of you, he's referring to Judas, who's about ready to betray him. Jesus says to Peter, "You're all clean. I'm just going to wash your feet because it got dirty from the road that we've been walking on." But what I think is really going on is that Jesus is in the middle of giving a perfectly good sermon illustration, and someone pulls out a train, and everybody thinks, "Oh, that's beautiful. I wonder if that belongs to the Thomas collection." And all the people behave like dogs. Squirrel! And Jesus is trying to do this, I don't believe, to set up a franchise of foot washing, but to help people know that Jesus, the leader, is willing to do anything. And that's an example for the disciples, that they should be willing to do anything, even things that other people would consider menial. Peter says, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus says, "You're all washed. I'm just doing this to wash your feet as an example. If I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's. I've set an example so that you should do as I have done." So every now and then, about this time of year, you see in the headlines that some church leader, is reenacting this ceremony, which is okay. Luckily, my perspective, luckily Jesus didn't say, "This is how I want you to remember me." Or once a week you'd come up to the altar and get your foot washed. But maybe by then we'd all get over it. Or maybe the church would be smaller, who knows? This is an example so that you should do not what I did, not the specifics. Sheep comes down full of unclean animals, voice says eat. It doesn't mean change your eating habits. Jesus says, I've done this as an example to show you that you should be willing to do anything to love the people next to you. There is nothing that you should say, "I know this act would bless the person next to me, but I'm not going to do it." You should, in humility, love one another, unbounded. Because the humble hear from God directly. The humble God instructs in God's way. We're going to take a moment for prayer. God, thank you for your mercy for us and your love for us and the example that Jesus was. And help us to do what Jesus calls us to do. Thank you. Amen. I've got one more verse from this text. The next verse. Jesus says, I've set you an example that you should do as I have done. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. Many Lutherans would like it to say, if you know these things, you are blessed. We like to study, we like to learn, but that's not what Jesus says. Just knowing doesn't help. But knowing and taking action, that will bring a blessing. Amen.